This is Up Close. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. Love stories make up a large part of American culture, though beyond the biblical book of Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim, it doesn't seem to be the biggest part of Jewish culture. And yet, this year, the love story of two Jewish women was the one that ended discrimination against same-sex marriages within the U.S. federal government in what instantly became one of the most famous Supreme Court decisions. Arguing that case was lawyer Roberta Kaplan, and she shares her story and theirs in Then Comes Marriage, United States v. Windsor, and the Defeat of DOMA. And then, two women are trying to put love stories into the heart of the Jewish tradition with retellings of folk tales, love letters from prominent Jewish thinkers, and more. Peninnah Schram and Rabbi Eisenberg Sasso discuss their partnered effort, Jewish stories of love and marriage, folk tales, legends, and letters. But first, here's my interview with Roberta Kaplan on one love story that might be remembered for centuries. So U.S. v. Windsor, the case that essentially ends gay marriage discrimination by the federal government, is a huge civil rights victory. And it's often the case that people who represent major civil rights cases as they're going through the courts are become very personally involved in the case. But this case was extremely personal for you from day one.
You know, I got a call. My client is this incredible woman, now 86, by the name of Edie Windsor, whose spouse, both Jewish, by the way, whose spouse, Thea Spire, passed away in late 2009. And they'd been married, they'd been together for 44 years, and they were married before they died. But because of this law that we attacked, the so-called Defense of Marriage Act, the federal government treated their marriage as if it never happened, as null and void. And Edie had to pay a huge estate tax bill to the IRS. Again, as if she'd inherited everything they kind of amassed over all the years, including their apartment, from a stranger. So she was, to use her words, indignant about that, and she went looking for a lawyer, and through kind of a roundabout way, she got to me. But the truly incredible thing about it is that when I got that call, I had never met her before. I'd never laid eyes on her, but I knew exactly who she was. And it's not because she was the celebrity she is today, it's because 18 years before that, I had been in my third year of law school at Columbia, and I think it's fair to say I was kind of a late bloomer in terms of coming out. I was very anxious about it. I was very concerned about breaking ties with the Jewish community and not being able to have the family and the home that I wanted. And so I waited kind of till the bitter end of my third year in law school, and it just so happened that shortly thereafter, my parents were coming to visit from Cleveland. Even worse, it just so happens that it was Gay Pride weekend, and as my parents were coming to visit me, they kind of had to wend their way. I was living on the Upper West Side through the Gay Pride parade, and by the time they got to my apartment, I think it's fair to say they were in a high state. And they started talking about, you know, what's everyone, remember this is 1991, so it's a very different world. What's everyone so proud of? What's with all the rainbow flags? My college roommate's mom was then Manhattan Borough president, so what's Ruth Messinger doing, leading this parade, on and on and on. And I said to my mom, please stop. And as mothers are kind of wont to do, she continued. And then she finally said to me, why do you want me to stop? Are you gay? And I said yes. And I had a teeny studio apartment, but she went over to the corner and literally started beating her head against the wall. People say literally, yeah. Literally like a Seinfeld episode, although it was way before Seinfeld. As you could imagine, well, let me just say one thing before I go on. This is not a criticism of my mom. My parents could not be more proud of me and my family and everything we've accomplished today. My mom's asked me to forgive her for this probably 10 million times. Parents and children.
And have you?
Many times, at least 10 million times I have. Parents and children make mistakes, and that's fine. You know, people evolve on this issue, so it's not an attack on my parents. But as you can imagine, I was kind of depressed because kind of my worst fears about what would happen from coming out happened. And I was in New York City that summer. I was moving to Boston, but I went around asking for a psychologist, and this is the way you spoke back then, who was good at gay issues. And the name I kept getting was a woman by the name of Thea Spire, believe it or not. And so I actually saw Edie's spouse as a patient twice in 1991 in their apartment, because Thea, who had MS, was already paralyzed in 1991, so she saw patients in her living room. I remember it like it was yesterday. I mean, Thea did an incredible amount to help me. She had such charisma and confidence and power. But probably the most incredible part about it is that she spoke about Edie. I'm not a psychologist. I'm just a lawyer, but I think it's unusual for psychologists to speak about their own lives, and so I spent a lot of time kind of thinking about why she did that, and I think she did it because I was so despondent at that time, so cynical at the idea of ever having the kind of life that I wanted, that Thea was convinced that the only way she could persuade me is if she told me about her own life. So she talked about Edie Windsor, this brilliant mathematician, she said, I remember, who was this brilliant computer scientist who'd studied at NYU. Again, I can remember it. And that was it. I never saw Thea again. I lived nearby, and I would occasionally, especially on gay pride parades, see her sitting in her wheelchair by the building, but I never approached her. When I got the call from Edie, though, I knew exactly where to go to meet her. I met her the next day. I knew how to get to her apartment. When I walked in, even though I knew where I was going, when I saw the chair that I had sat in and where Thea had sat, it kind of all came back to me. All the emotions came back. And I said to Edie, you have to give me a minute. I've been here before. And then I explained why. The next thing I said to Edie was, you do not look like I imagined you, because I thought I had this image in my head of her as a math geek. So I thought she was going to have kind of like a slide rule and a flannel shirt and, kind of thick glasses, which is not the way, if people can see the photo, that Edie Windsor looks. And then the third thought that I had, I remember too, almost again like it was yesterday, is God had given me this opportunity to pay Thea back for what she'd done to help me, and I was going to do it.
And there's so much there just about the shift that we've seen in what is now 24 years since 1991, where
God, I'm old. Yes,
right,
true.
But it's been a trajectory that I think it's obviously surprised great numbers of people at how quick and how fast things have changed, to the point where, I thought one of the interesting things about Thea Spire telling you that story was that she couldn't tell you a story about half a dozen people whom she knew who were living. She really didn't have a great sample set, right, to work from. That's also the story of this case. And it's the story of the Supreme Court's evolution on this issue. And it's the story of our president's evolution on this issue. And it's the story of the evolution of uncountable millions of people who had struggle coming out, about how simply meeting someone who can say, I live this life, and I am that person whom you've been thinking about, does that exist? And that confirmation again and again through meeting people has changed American society.
There's no question about that. So what's really amazing is I did the New York marriage case, seeking marriage rights in New York before New York's highest court in 2006, and I lost that case badly. If you compare, though, the briefs in that case in 2006 to the briefs that were filed in the case last summer, 2015, there's really no difference. The arguments haven't changed, the cases haven't changed, the principles haven't changed. What's changed is the ability of judges to hear those arguments. And what's changed that is what you just said. It's people coming out. Everyone has always known gay people, but not everyone has already realized that they knew gay people, right? And when you realize that you have someone who's close to you, a family member or a friend or a colleague or a neighbor who's gay, it's pretty hard, I think, to accept the fact that it's okay to discriminate against them or treat them as second class simply because of who they are. There's no question that's what changed things. Edie, when we won the case, was asked on the steps of the Supreme Court, what is it that's brought about this incredibly dramatic change? And she said, perfect answer as always, she said, one day, one guy woke up one morning and had the courage to get up and say, I'm gay. And then another, and then another, and then another. Rabbi Heschel said the same thing. It takes one and then another to start a movement. It's the same principle. But that must be odd for you as the lawyer arguing in this case to say, because presumably you feel that you contributed, something to making this legal argument win. Well, I think we did a really good job in the case. I'm very proud of the job we did. I think if you read our brief, it's a brief that anyone can understand. The first 8 pages are a love story. You don't have to be a fancy lawyer to understand what we said. I think anyone can. I think I did a pretty good job arguing in the Supreme Court, and I handled their questions pretty well. But I do think, and I'm someone who came out and lives my life as openly gay, but I do believe that we all did this together. I mean, it was every single gay person who had the courage to do that. It was all our friends and allies. It was, the Jewish Theological Seminary for the first time ever in its history, putting in an amicus brief on our side. That's what changed the world. There's no single person who changed the world here. We did it together.
If there's one person who's changing changed the world on this issue, though, it's Justice Kennedy, right? And
his mind kind of matters.
He's the one who essentially made what had been a 4-5 losing battle in the Supreme Court on these issues into a 5-4 winning battle on these issues. And he's crafted what I find very interesting as a theological matter, as a legal matter, as a philosophical matter, this doctrine of dignity that has defined his legal opinions or his decisions on gay issues for the past decade or so. And first of all, I guess, was there an element where you were seeing the signal there in his decisions and seeing how this case specifically tied into that idea of dignity?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, so Justice Kennedy is unique among any Supreme Court justice that I'm aware of, in the sense that, first of all, in hot-button political cases today, whether it's gay rights, voting rights, abortion rights, doesn't really matter, affirmative action, he is the key vote. He is often the deciding vote. He recently said at Harvard Law School that he doesn't swing, cases do. But regardless of what you call it, his vote is the vote that decides the case. So we were very aware of that. And on top of that, in this area of gay rights, this is what I was about to say, I'm not aware of a justice who's so dominated an area the way he has. He has now written every major Supreme Court decision on gay rights, starting with Romer in 1996, Lawrence in 2003, Windsor in 2013, and Obergefell in 2015. That's unprecedented. And so we were, as you can imagine, very focused on Judge Kennedy when we prepared the case. I spent a lot of time reading his opinions and reading the language that he uses in describing things and tried to speak in his voice. And we were aware of this concept of dignity because it's come up before in his cases. So we were keyed into it. I don't know, obviously, I've never spoken to Justice Kennedy about this. I don't know what the source of it is. But I wouldn't be surprised to learn that the source of it is the similar religious view that many Jewish people have, which is that everyone was created in the divine image, and that means that everyone has dignity. I do believe that animates Justice Kennedy, and I do believe this concept of dignity comes from that. You don't have to agree with everyone, but you have to agree that everyone has dignity.
And I wonder for you, personally, in taking on this case, given how much was personally at stake for you in your relationship with the deceased, who was, at the heart of the case, in being in a lesbian marriage with you already had a child at the time when you took on this case, and there's all kinds of ways in which DOMA would be affecting your life. Was there a part where you were almost scared to take it on and say, oh boy, this has huge consequences for me? I don't know.
So the short answer is no, but the longer answer is more complicated because, I put a Post-it on my computer when I was working on the case that said, it's all about Edie Stupid, borrowing from the Clinton campaign. And part of that was to constantly tell myself that the way we were going to win this case was to focus on the facts of Edie and Thea's life. If we could convince the justices that their marriage was the same as anyone else's, which it was, we thought we would win. But after that, I think, when looking back, I think there was another reason I put that Post-it up there, and that was to constantly remind myself, at least subconsciously, that my duty as a lawyer was to kind of put my own mishigas, for lack of a better term, out of it, and to focus only on Edie. I think that's my job in any case. I do that with any client. But here, for the reasons you mentioned, because it was so personal to me, it was really important that I stay focused on dividing and creating that division. And I think I did a very good job of it for the most part. But there were a couple times, particularly during the oral arguments, and you can hear my voice crack, when the Chief Justice at one point said to me, isn't it true that politicians are falling over themselves to support your side of the case? And in my response, my voice cracks. That's, I think, Robbie Kaplan coming out. I just couldn't hold it in anymore. In retrospect, I think it was probably okay. I think it was effective. But I did, for the most part, try to keep it down. The other thing I can say is when I was done arguing the case and I sat back down at the lawyer's table, the only emotion I felt and the overwhelming emotion I felt was relief. It wasn't even joy. It was relief, like, oh my God, thank God I didn't mess this up. And when I felt that way, I felt an incredible burden, given the fact I was not only arguing for myself, but for millions of other people throughout the country.
And today, you're a great hero of the LGBT rights movement. But obviously, I don't know if it's a coin flip, but there's a sizable chance that you could have been a goat. And we've seen in the three major eras of civil rights legal movements, from African Americans to women and now to LGBT rights, that there were various episodes of progress and setbacks, and a lot of it had to do with timing, and there were moments when you could have a Dred Scott decision, or you could have actually this law of DOMA was in large part a reaction to some legislative initiatives in the Clinton administration that turned out to be ill-timed, and that there was enough of a reactionary movement in a Republican Congress to create a law that would explicitly discriminate against gays and lesbians for a generation, for nearly 20 years. And there was a part here with this case specifically where, according to the powers that be, who decide in various civil rights halls of power, that this was not the case. This was not the case that was going to ride forward. Yeah. And various groups turned it down and told Edith Windsor, "You're not our spokesperson." And in a sense, there was an act of defiance there on your part to pick up the case and ride it forward. So what?
Yeah, it was kind of chutzpah of me. You're right.
Right.
Why?
So yeah, why did you feel like you could say to the various extremely well, from Land Legal and ACLU and everybody, and say, you're wrong?
Right. Well, a couple things. So first of all, Edie had paid this huge tax bill. At the time, no one knew that our case was getting to the Supreme Court. I knew a case would get to the Supreme Court, but I was very focused on the trial court here in New York and on the Second Circuit. And I was pretty comfortable knowing the judges, I practiced in New York now for many years, that we would win in both the Southern District of New York and the Second Circuit. And if Edie didn't sue, then she had no chance of getting her money back. So I didn't really feel comfortable telling a then 82-year-old lady that she'd paid $363,000 because of an unjust tax and that she should just give it up. So that was part of it. Second of all, I was convinced that she was the perfect spokesperson. I thought this image of this beautiful, incredibly articulate, incredibly smart, charismatic Jewish lady was the perfect spokesman for our movement in so many ways. Not only because of the marriage that she had with Thea. I mean, I think the one thing I know about life, the only thing I know about life for sure, is that no one knows what's happening tomorrow, right? No one knows that you wake up tomorrow and God forbid you find out that you're going to get a diagnosis like Thea did of MS. But the one thing I think we do know is if that ever happens, it'd be great to have a spouse like Edie Windsor by our side. So I thought Americans would really understand that, be able to relate to it. I thought that her life before Thea even, and some of the discrimination she experienced growing up in Philadelphia, actually getting married to a guy because she was afraid to be gay, I thought that would really tell the story. And then I loved the tax piece of it. Our country started, call me crazy, but I think our country started because of a fight about unfair taxation. Americans hate paying taxes. And the idea that she had to pay this huge tax simply for being gay, I thought would really hit home.
Right. And there's something really interesting there about the fact that it was a tax case. Right. And the way that we, as an American society, decide to move forward on what could be seen by some as the side issues. Right. And then we decide that these symbolic things are what we're really going to talk about and create decisions that ripple outward.
Well, and that's how the legal system works, fortunately or unfortunately, depending how you look at it. But laws get made and Supreme Court decisions get decided based on kind of particularized factual circumstances. And I just thought this was the greatest factual circumstance. If you had to make up Edie Windsor, I don't think you could do a better job. And she's obviously proven to be such a wonderful spokesperson. There was a moment in the case when I was pretty sure that we were going to win. It was about 4 or so weeks before I argued the case. The Supreme Court actually invited me to come kind of check out. It was my first time arguing, so check out the podium and kind of check out the scene. And as we were leaving, this lovely employee at the Supreme Court said to me, "Do you need help leaving the Supreme Court building on the day you argue?" And I said, no, thank you. Edie's fine walking. We'll walk out, but thank you for the offer. And then a kind of a light bulb went off in my head, and I said, but wait a minute, why'd you ask me that? And she said, well, because another lawyer in the case has asked that we kind of help him leave through the back door. And I said to her, well, thank you so much, but I'm pretty sure Edie Windsor is going to want to go out the front door. And that's when I knew we'd won, because the fact that the House Republicans wanted to go out the back door meant that we'd won the case.
Right, and that's part of the tangled history of this case, where you're suing an Obama administration that more or less doesn't want to defend this law, and that had to strain itself at times to defend it, and at times refused to.
Yeah. No, I mean, the one thing in the case that really probably surprised me the most was when the Obama administration switched sides. Because originally they were defending the case. There's this long story I tell in the book about me kind of being very stubborn and telling them I wouldn't give them an extension to have more time to think about what they were going to do. I ultimately did, kicking and screaming. And then it was spring break in 2011, as I recall, and I got this email saying, we want to have a phone call with you from Tony West, who was then the third in command at DOJ. And on the call, he said, we've gone through the factors, and we don't think that this statute is constitutional, and we're not going to defend it. I had tears, literally tears streaming down my face. When I had given them the extension, I had kind of been sarcastic, and I'd said at the end of the call that I would be praying, I literally had the chutzpah to say this, I'd be praying for the President and Attorney General Holder when they were making this decision. And at the end of that call, when they announced the change, Tony said to me, he said, Robbie, remember what you said about praying for me and the President? I said, yeah. He said, I just want you to know that sometimes prayer works. That was probably one of the most moving moments in the whole case. But I'm still amazed by that. I mean, presidents have done it, and they absolutely have a right and an obligation to do it, but it's not common. And I don't think here, I'm very uncomfortable comparing gay rights to African-American rights directly, because no gay person that I know of, Edie is no Rosa Parks in the sense that Edie never had to worry about getting hauled off and killed.
Right. It's a very great thing to be sitting there worrying about your huge estate tax
Exactly
issue.
Right. Perfect. On the other hand, I don't think it's a coincidence that the 3 men who made the decision not to defend DOMA are all black guys. The President, Attorney General Holder, and Tony. I think when they sat down and said to themselves, can we write a brief saying it's okay for a legislature to pass laws that treat gay people differently, they said, we're not writing that brief.
But there's also something there about this period, this 6-year period, right, which tracks with your case, which tracks with the Obama administration, and tracks a number of other developments where we've seen a president, a party, a country go from leaning against gay marriage, leaning against same-sex marriage, and to fully a majority, and the president can count votes, and he knows his party, his country, his donations from Hollywood, and so on and so forth. We're all tracking, this one issue, and it was time to make that jump, and your case gives that
We tried to help it along.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, do I think in my heart of hearts that President Obama evolved on this issue? Probably not. I think he was always for gay equality. But obviously the fact that he made the call when he did and he announced it publicly is based on all the factors you just discussed, the politics, the polls, the atmosphere. So we tried to help him along.
But that cynical play, right, is something that I think speaks to a lot of themes that run throughout your life and this book, where once one is going to say, all right, I'm going to impose some limits on what it means to be what it means to be completely free as a citizen of the United States who's gay or is a lesbian, then there are all kinds of like fights that can pop up. And you talk about, like, even within your own life, when you were not yet out and you became classified because of the walls that you put up to deal with that. You became classified on campus at Harvard as a homophobe.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, look, I the one thing, I remember shortly after we filed the case, we had kind of a phone call with ACLU supporters. And someone on the call said to Edie, what's it like to be a plaintiff? It must take incredible bravery. And Edie, again, gave the greatest answer. She said, the truth is, in your life, you're always coming out, which is true. You're always deciding, do I tell this cabbie? Do I tell this person at the hotel where we're staying? You're constantly making those choices. Edie said, but it's one thing, and I was pretty out before I filed this case. She said, but it's one thing to be out, and it's another thing to be the out lesbian who happens to be suing the United States of America. And as the attorney representing the out lesbian who happens to be suing the United States of America, I clearly am out too and really don't have that choice. I can tell you it's liberating. Even before then, I think when we had our son, I don't fully understand how you can be a parent and be honest with your child and be a role model to your kid if you're not going to be fully out. I don't know how you do that. I don't want to judge people who don't, but I think it's very difficult. And so once we had our son, the closet door was pretty much down for me. But obviously with this case, it's completely down. And, I can't tell you how much better it's made my life in so many ways.
And finally, one of the things that you talk about a lot is how Jewish life and a sense of Jewish connection has been woven through your life in discovering you were a lesbian and coming out as a lesbian and developing a family. You met your wife at Rosh Hashanah services. And so what has that Jewish connection done for you in this whole process?
So I think two things, kind of opposites, which makes sense if it's a Jewish issue. I mean, on the one hand, I think being Jewish, it was very hard for me in terms of coming out because I wanted to have the same connection. I grew up in Cleveland, very, very close Jewish community. I wanted that same connection to the Jewish community as an adult that I'd had as a kid. And I didn't think I could have it when I was growing up. And there's no question that's what kept me in the closet for so long. On the other hand, everything I've learned as a Jew, the concept of tikkun olam, and the concept of tzedek tirdof, which by the way was my bat mitzvah portion, believe it or not. All those lessons that I learned about pursuing justice, I think helped motivate me and gave me, and I think even gave Edie, who's Jewish too, the courage to do what she did. And it's been, there are all these Judaism is in a way a religion of time. And there's so much about the case and in the calendar of the case that was Jewish. We had, as you say, I met my wife on Rosh Hashanah. We had a Seder in Washington, D.C. 2 days before the Supreme Court argument. I had my Second Circuit argument the day after Yom Kippur, and I begged the judges here to put it off a day, and they wouldn't. And that's natural. I mean, if you're a religious person and your calendar is observed according to religious observance, that's the way life should be, and it's definitely interwoven throughout the book.
Yeah, well, let's see how we continue to weave these things through our lives. Roberta Kaplan,
thank you so much. Nice to meet you.
And now, Rabbi Sandy Eisenberg Sasso and Peninnah Schram on Eternal Jewish Stories of Love and Marriage. When you talk to people about the Jewish tradition, you talk about love stories in the Jewish tradition, I would imagine that most people, if you say, well, we're here to talk about love stories in the Jewish tradition, they go, all right, Song of Songs, and I'm sure there's something else.
The Torah and the biblical oral tradition and the midrashic oral tradition filled with love stories. In fact, I really think that all of our stories that the Jewish people tell are love stories, because you have the stories between the love of the Jewish people and God, or between parents and children, or friends and friends. But when we're talking about more of the, not even the romantic, but the love relationship that develops into a marriage, oh my goodness, there are so many beautiful love stories.
I was going to say there's such a rich tradition of love stories, and what's striking is that there are many similarities between the love stories of the past and those we have today, even though they're different forms. But issues of trials and challenges and forgiveness and patience, they're such very powerful stories that still speak to us today in many ways.
And it requires a little bit of reimagining of what you think of as a love story if you just watch romantic comedies and think that that's the contemporary love story. That love is a many-faceted thing, and it's a many-flavored thing. Right?
And a many-splendored thing.
Right. And there are some stories that you end up including here that that a lot of people would probably, in America today, would probably initially say, is that really a love story? Is that, and then as you explain it and as you tell it, maybe they would understand more why it is a love story. But they're offbeat in that sense. Some of them.
Well, yes, but these stories are about relationships, and of course, storytelling is the most human activity we have. As Jews, we are a storytelling people, so that these stories really wrestle with the same questions that, as Sandy pointed out, that we still work with and wrestle with and confront and ponder. And yet, what these stories, I think, really teach us, the wisdom that we need for our relationships. If you look back, the respect that comes with the relationship before the passionate love. I mean, if you look at Isaac and Rebecca.
That's interesting, and I was going to say that's somewhat of a difference in what we experience today. I mean, first, in some of the older stories, it's marriage and then love. There isn't that romantic dating experience. And today it's romance often, and then comes marriage. But that doesn't, even though there are clear differences, but there are still certain themes that run through. And even though this is called Jewish stories of love and marriage, these are universal stories. I think that's what's so powerful, is it teaches us something about what it means to commit to another person, what it means to have a relationship, and what happens in that relationship.
Well, do you think that after assembling all these stories, so you've got biblical stories and midrashic stories and Talmudic stories, and you've got a variety of folk tales that you've gathered, and then you've got even love letters from people of various eras. But in all of that, do you not think that there is a particularly Jewish statement about love that's made here, a particularly Jewish statement about relationships and marriage?
Well, I think there is a Jewish statement, but that doesn't mean it's not also a universal statement. It begins with the particular, with the specifics, and you can read that. Some of the imagery and some of the symbolism is clearly Jewish. But you can take a step outside of that, and relationships between two people have a universal feel.
So what are some examples there?
Well, I was going to give you an example. The love letters were things that I just fell in love. I mean, I fell in love with these letters. I kept looking for more and more. So there's one love letter between Martin Buber and his wife Paula.
And Martin Buber was the famous philosopher of the early
20th century philosopher who I happen to feel very close to because I used a lot of his writings in my rabbinate. And he says, everything is in everyone, and love extracts that. So everything is in everyone, but you don't really experience it except through the particular person. And that's what we hear, the particular voice of the Jewish people through these stories.
This is also true of the folk tales and of all the stories, because when we're talking about the universal message, it's part of the Jewish tradition, but it is not exclusively Jewish. I call it the fluid folklore process, but you can say this about the midrashim and the biblical stories and the love letters, because we tell stories from our Jewish sources, but then Jews have traveled everywhere in the world, and they've listened to other people's stories. And when a story kind of touches your heart, you transform it into a Jewish story. You see it through Jewish eyes, and so you tell a variant of that story. And when you look through the folk tales, and we've sourced all of our stories. There are stories that are told in so many different countries that are part of world folklore, but they are meaningful because the themes are dominant within the Jewish oral tradition. It's the beauty of creating bonds between people within the Jewish tradition, but also in the world around.
And so what is an example then of what makes a folktale turn into a Jewish folktale or have a Jewish sensibility?
Funny you should ask. Dovnoy, the great folklorist, talked about 4 major components that will identify a story as Jewish. Very quickly, the 3 of them are guidelines. They're external, they're not essential. One is time. There may be a time element. In one story, the woman says something about something happens every Monday and Thursday. A time element that is very clearly identified as Jewish with the Torah readings on Monday and Thursday, but it's meant to mean it happens frequently, it's repeated. So it's not essential that it be in a story as an identified Jewish time period. Place is another. Character, Jewish characters. But what Dovnoy talked about that is essential to be in a story is a Jewish message. The Jewish theme, if you will, the motif that is consistent with Jewish tradition, that resonates in Jewish tradition.
And so what is a classic love story that then has this, there's a Jewish version and a not Jewish version, and there's a Jewish theme there?
It isn't necessarily different. Details will differ. Different countries, different foods, but the message remains the same. It's just that it is very dominant within the Jewish tradition. It's important.
So you have a lot of historical experiences that that get manifest through these stories. I mean, so there are a couple things that I am connected to when you ask this question. So I'm thinking of the love letters. I'll go back to letters, and between Rabbi Regina Jonas, who was the first woman ordained as a rabbi in 1935 in Berlin, who ultimately died in Auschwitz, and her beloved Rabbi Norden, and they have this correspondence. This is the first time that such letters have ever been published, by the way. They were translated from the German. So, but you get a reflection of what's happening historically at the same time. I mean, you sense this deep Jewish connection. Of course, there's 2 rabbis, so that's clear. But there are certain hidden references to the Nazi era that's going on, so you see that reflected. And so there are many stories in here that are clearly connected to Jewish personalities. There's a wonderful folktale, one of my favorite ones, about the Maharal, Rabbi Judah Loew of Prague, who is the Golem rabbi, right? And he, I knew a lot about him because I'm very interested in Jewish mysticism. I had never known anything about his marriage and his love life. And this legend, which probably is in part true, some of it's a little fantastic, is he was married to this woman, Pearl. She was also a scholar in her own right, and they were buried together in the Prague cemetery with one headstone over their grave. And it so happened, as I was writing this story for this book, I was also traveling to Prague, and there I saw that. And so you see clearly some Jewish historical connections there, as well as the many things that Peninnah had said.
There's an example, for instance, the man and woman of Tzidon, and it's in the Midrash. It's a very short, I call it a haiku kind of story. It's a brushstroke of a man and woman who are married but have no child after 10 years, and so they go to the rabbi to separate, and the rabbi says, you have to start or end your marriage with a feast as you started with a feast. And at the feast, the husband says to his wife, when you leave, take the most precious thing you see in the house and take it with you. And of course, what she does is she takes the husband. She chooses him as the most precious thing in their life. And that little incident has gone into world folklore. It's in many, many versions of what we call the clever wife or the clever young daughter. It's a motif that you'll find in world folk tales all over the world, because it's part of the motif, the clever innkeeper's daughter. And so the wisdom of the wife choosing the husband, and that you'll find in so many countries and cultures and variants of this folk tale.
So there's actually an interesting story I can tell in relationship to doing this book. It so happened as we were working together on this that I was preparing to do a wedding for a couple, and the bride came in, for an interview, and we were going to discuss, and she says, by the way, the other day I was in my grandparents' home, and we were looking for a bag to take to a football game, and we found a bag, but it was filled with letters. It was the letters my grandfather wrote to my grandmother, and I said, you're kidding me. I'm writing this book on love and marriage. Could you please get me that bag? I read through hundreds of gorgeous love letters. And then I asked them if I could use a couple of them for the book, which I did. And then when I did the wedding for their granddaughter, I read from those letters as the best advice they could possibly have for their marriage together, because these people have been married close to 60 years. So there's something very universal in that, and yet very particular. It was, having a Jewish foundation. And as soon as that happened, and I said I published their letters, I have people coming to me, why didn't you publish mine? And I didn't even know people had them. All these beautiful love letters that are out there, I feel so badly that we couldn't have included them. But that they meant a lot to these people to hold on to handwritten love letters at the beginning of love.
You say handwritten.
Yeah, that's very important.
And that is so important, because now it's tweeting and emails. But I was blessed to find the letters my father wrote to my mother when he first met her and courted her. And I have it in the book. I translated them from the Yiddish. And what makes them very Jewish Yiddish love letters, not only because they were written in Yiddish, but he makes all kinds of analogies and allusions to the Purim and the Passover holidays. My father was a cantor, a chazan, also a shochet and a moel, but he really integrated the Jewish traditions and his Jewish practice and his role as a cantor in these letters. And the handwriting is what evoked an emotional response when I first saw them. And so handwriting is something.
Yeah, that was especially powerful. Yeah. I mean, we had some handwritten letters of some fairly prominent rabbis, Isaac Mayer Wise from the Reform movement, Rabbi Eisenstein from the Reconstructionist movement. And here you knew them as big personalities, great philosophers. And you saw this very gentle handwriting, human part of them. And that was what was so striking. I mean, we know what these people thought in terms of their philosophy, but we didn't know what these people felt, and that was a whole wonderful dimension to discover. I think we've lost a little bit of that when we write too fast on an email. Wouldn't it be wonderful if people could get back to the handwriting and the handwritten letter?
Well, let's talk about that a little more, because there's probably no one whom you'll marry in the next, or whom you've married in the last 15 years or so, who's had handwritten love letters. You were a professor at Stern College. Probably none of those students were having any handwritten letter love affairs with anybody in the past.
A lot of emails, though. A lot of emails.
Do you think that? But even then, and right now you hear the young singles, and they're on Tinder, where it's about swiping right and swiping left to decide who you're with, and it just becomes reduced further and further to emoticons and emoji into what people are discussing. And obviously in publishing a book right now with this, you're saying there is very specific contemporary relevance to this way of doing love. And
yes, and in fact I met a young couple who had just been married just last week. And I told him about the book, and I said, you know, you need to read or tell each other stories every night.
So that's how this book started. I mean, this is really interesting that you asked that. So my daughter was getting married. It'll be 10 years in December. So it took us that long, right? My daughter was getting married, and I said, well, I'd like to give her something special at the ofra, you know, at the blessing before the wedding. And I said, you know, what do? Well, I write. So I want to write her love story as she has shared it with me. And then I want to include the past. I want to include stories from the past to help her see that she's part of this great chain of tradition. So I first called Peninnah, and I said, Peninnah, tell me where I can find some really good love stories. She suggested some, of course.
From my other books.
I put them together with some poetry, and then I gave it to her as a gift at her ofra. And I said to Peninnah afterwards, oh my gosh, there's nothing out there. You can find a piece here and a piece there in different books. Why don't we put something together? Well, it took us a time to find time in our lives, but then we came up with this book. So the idea is I wanted something written that she could hold, and I wanted her story written. The more we tell stories about who we are and where we come from, the stronger sense of identity we have. And not just for ourselves, but for the next generation. Children love to hear stories about how their parents first met. It's part of their creation. It's how they came to be. And they have a much stronger sense of who they are the more of those stories they hear.
Those stories that we have really as our legacy to pass on, transmit from generation to generation, really gives us that wisdom, the sense of wonder, the sense of who we are as people, as you said. Instills in us hope, the most essential component in life, and healing and bonds between people and identity of who we are, and in a larger sense of the group of the Jewish people. I mean, there's so much power in storytelling.
And these are all not just, you know, happy stories. No. I mean, there's stories of people who have been through tremendous trial and challenge. I mean, I have a story of a woman who was a stroke victim and a man who was a quadriplegic who met on a handicap bus and got married. I mean, and how they live their life still stuns me, okay? But how do you overcome all these challenges? I mean, that gives us something to think about in our own relationships. And I want to say something else. We were very careful to reflect the diversity of marriage that exists today that is different than in the past. So there is a story of two men who have partnered and married. There's stories of two women. There's an intermarriage story because we feel we need age differences, an older person, a younger person, you know, a second marriage, either after a divorce or after a death. We want to give the sense of the fullness of love and how is it expressed today.
In one case, there's a woman who is also a writer who survived the concentration camps and married the American soldier who rescued her. They fell in love. It's a gorgeous love story, and it's her granddaughter who just married a year ago and found her love, who's telling the story and framing it with her own contemporary love story. And the other thing is that not all these stories are in a written form, but rather in art.
There are some, very beautiful.
And one with a calligraphy of the verses of the Hakafot during Sukkot and Simchat Torah when they first met. And so the story is told through 5 illustrations, but the characters are in with the micography of the psukim from the holidays. And
when you talk about how you create how you've gathered contemporary love stories, and even the love letters are largely pretty contemporary in the sense of the larger Jewish chronology that's out there. We have this sense many people have, that when we look at our ancestors and the ancients, that to think of them as very quaint people and very different people from us. And you were saying before how when you look at some of these greater philosophers and rabbis, how you got a very different perspective of them because you were able to see their love letters and you had previously only been exposed to the stuff that they intentionally made public, the scholarship and so forth. And the further you go back in history, the more you only get that, typically. And when you look back at that older Jewish tradition, did it make you think, first of all, do you find love inspiration there in the same way that you do from these fuller, more rounded stories that we have of more contemporary loves?
I think so. I mean, it depends, of course. But I mean, first of all, Song of Songs, which you mentioned at the beginning. What a beautiful, sensuous, physical kind of love. I mean, that, of course, we use references from there and quotes from there in many of our weddings. Quite striking and inspiring. So, I mean, another example, which I was partly surprised about, you know, I wrote the David and Jonathan story. I took out all the wars. I just went through their relationship. So I deleted little sections. And it's a gorgeous love story. I mean, in a time of trial, you know, where families didn't always agree with each other. So, and then you take other stories where people are dealing with infertility and jealousy and quarrels and lying and, you know, and you begin to see how people make a life out of that. And I think to some extent that is, can be inspiring. It depends how you want to look at this. As story or as fact. I think it's, you know, there are many of them are not fact in any way, but they contain certain truths and they're quite powerful.
In fact, our earliest letter that we could find comes from the 13th century, the beginning of the 13th century, and then there's one in the late 16th century. So these are people who were writing yearning for the person who is far away from them. There's a man it was found in the Egyptian Geniza, some fragments of these love letters when he was on the way to India, yearning for his wife and regretting that the one thing that he cannot do is fulfill his legal obligations to his wife on Friday night, Erev Shabbat. So it's just beautiful to read these human feelings and emotions, and I think in all the letters, the yearning, and in the folk tales, the yearning goes on.
That deal with times of separation. You know, when the people cannot be together. This is their only connection. The words are the only connection. And like there are some pretty stunning letters by Dreyfus and his wife when he was in prison. So here are loves that are sustained even when there is separation, even when there's imprisonment, you know, even when there are challenges. And so I think that moves us to figure out, you know, where are we in our relationship, given the challenges that we face. And we do encourage people at the end. The last chapter is how to write your own love story. So we're saying, okay, get off the computer for just a few moments and take a pen and a paper and write your story. And because you preserve that, it's not just for you. I mean, think years after your marriage, okay? I've been married 45 years. You know, how do you recapture that enormous, powerful feeling that you had when you first met? Well, you read the letter and it comes back. I actually I wrote my husband and my meeting love story in here. I wrote that and I just went back there. You know, I could gain that emotion.
And grandchildren to see the people who came before them as human beings. We were young once, kind of thing. We went through the same trials and tribulations and heartsick and crushed and, you know, all of the same experiences. It's the human love story. And I hope that everyone will get the book and not only write their love stories, but read and tell stories to each other. It enhances and keeps alive, ignites the fire of love.
All right, well, let's hope everybody does do that. Peninnah Schram, Sandy Eisenberg Sasso, thank you for joining us.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
That's all for this week's episode of Up Close. A reminder, you can also listen to an audio-only version of this program as a podcast available on iTunes and your favorite podcast player.